History is written by the victors, and they rarely tell the whole truth. The story of Carthage is a tapestry woven more from rumor and propaganda than from fact, creating a civilization of monsters and mysteries in our imagination. By the end of this journey, you will possess a clearer, more fascinating portrait of Rome's greatest rival, stripped of 2,000 years of lies. We will confront chilling accusations of infant sacrifice and hunt for treasures that may never have existed. Were the Carthaginians a barbaric horde or the victims of history's greatest smear campaign? What forgotten truths lie buried beneath the most enduring legends? How much of what we think we know about the past is merely a story told by the last one standing? The portrait of a barbaric horde is the first and most fundamental lie. Carthage was not a monolithic culture of savages, but a dazzlingly diverse commercial empire. Imagine a city where the docks echoed with a dozen languages, where Phoenician merchants haggled with Greek philosophers, Egyptian artisans, and Iberian chieftains. This was Carthage. Its power was built not on brute force alone, but on a genius for integration and trade. They were master agriculturalists whose manuals on farming were so prized that the Romans translated them after Carthage's destruction. Their government featured a complex system of councils and elected officials, a republic in all but name, designed to balance the interests of wealthy families and prevent any single tyrant from seizing control. This sophisticated cosmopolitan reality was deliberately erased. Rome needed a monster, not a mirror. By painting the Carthaginians as a faceless, inhuman other, as a single-minded horde bent on destruction, they created the perfect enemy. It justified the unimaginable violence of the Punic Wars, framing Rome not as an imperial aggressor, but as civilization's last defender against a tidal wave of barbarism. The myth of the monolithic horde was the first and most necessary propaganda victory, one that has shaped our view of Carthage for 2 millennia. But this careful portrait of a sophisticated civilization shatters against one of history's darkest accusations. The second myth is the one that stains the very name of Carthage in our collective memory, the claim that they routinely sacrificed their own infants to a bronze idol of the god Baal-Hamon. It is a story of such profound horror that it has defined the Carthaginians as the ultimate barbarians for centuries. The ancient sources are chillingly specific. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing after Carthage was already a smoldering ruin, describes a terrible ritual. He claims that during a desperate military crisis, the Carthaginian elite, seeking divine favor, sacrificed 200 children of the noblest families, placing them one by one into the outstretched red-hot arms of a metal statue. The child would fall into a pit of fire below as flutes and drums drowned out the parents' cries. It is a visceral nightmare image, one designed to evoke maximum revulsion in a Roman audience. And for a very long time, the modern world simply accepted it as fact, the ultimate proof of Carthaginian depravity. Then, archaeologists began to dig at a place called the Tophet. Located just outside the ancient city walls, the Tophet was a sacred precinct filled with thousands of small stone markers. Beneath these markers were clay urns, and inside those urns were the charred bones of very young children and sometimes animals. At first glance, this seemed like grim, undeniable confirmation. Here was the physical evidence of the myth, the burnt offerings to a cruel god, case closed. But science is rarely so simple. As researchers looked closer, the story grew far more complicated and far more human. The first crack in the horrific narrative appears with the animal bones. Why were lambs and young goats found mixed with the human remains in identical urns, given identical markers? If this was purely about child sacrifice, the presence of these animal substitutes makes little sense. Unless, of course, the animals were the substitutes, some scholars now propose that the Tophet represents a complex cemetery for children who died too young from stillbirth, illness, or accident. In a culture that likely did not grant full funeral rites to unbaptized or very young children, the Tophet may have been a sacred, consecrated space to ensure these little souls were protected by the gods. The urns containing animal remains could represent a symbolic offering, a stand-in made by parents who could not bear to part with their child's actual body, or a vow fulfilled in a different way. The inscriptions on the markers add another layer of haunting ambiguity. They use a standard formula, a dedication to the Lord Baal-Hamon and the Lady Tanit. But the crucial verb is where the debate ignites. It is often translated as "he offered" or "he sacrificed." Yet in other Phoenician contexts, the same word can simply mean "he gave" or "he dedicated." A parent could give a child to the gods in death, entrusting them to divine care without it being an act of murder. So we are left standing in the dust of the Tophet, holding two competing truths. One is the literary tradition of Rome's bitter enemies, filled with propagandistic horror. The other is a silent field of small graves, a place of profound parental grief. The terrible, unanswerable question remains: did the Carthaginians, in moments of utter desperation, commit the unthinkable, believing it was the only way to save their city? Possibly, or were they a people mourning their most profound losses in the only way their culture allowed, only to have their most sacred grief twisted by their conquerors into a tale of demonic cruelty? The bones do not speak clearly enough to tell us, and that ambiguity is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, for it means we may never know whether this most infamous myth is a record of a true horror or history's most devastating slander against the dead. The most damning testimony against Carthage comes entirely from its enemies. Every gruesome detail of the infant sacrifice ritual, from the glowing bronze statue to the drowning drums, is recorded by Greek and Roman historians who never set foot in a living Carthage. This was not history, it was psychological warfare. Dehumanizing your enemy is the oldest trick in the book, and for Rome, painting the Carthaginians as child-killing monsters served a vital purpose. It transformed a brutal war for Mediterranean dominance into a sacred crusade, a battle of civilization against unspeakable evil. The Roman Senate could point to these stories and say, "Look what we are fighting against. Our cause is just, our enemy is subhuman." The myth justified total war and ultimately total annihilation. Yet modern archaeology forces us to sit in that uncomfortable space between propaganda and possibility. If the Tophet was merely a cemetery, why the consistent use of fire? Cremation was not the standard Phoenician burial practice. The presence of sacrificial terminology, however ambiguous, on the markers cannot be entirely dismissed. The emerging, nuanced view is that the truth may lie in a terrible middle ground. It is possible that the Carthaginians, in moments of existential crisis, a devastating plague, a crushing military defeat, a prolonged drought, resorted to what they believed was the ultimate offering to appease furious gods. This would not have been a casual daily atrocity, but a rare community-sanctioned act of sheer desperation, a horror born of fear for the survival of everyone. Think of it as the ancient world's most dire emergency measure, a cultural trauma so profound it left a physical scar on the landscape in the form of the Tophet. This pattern is echoed in other Phoenician colonies, from Sardinia to Sicily, where similar precincts with infant remains have been found. This suggests the concept, the theological framework for such an offering, existed across the Phoenician world. But crucially, the scale and frequency appear unique to Carthage. This raises another chilling question. Did the pressure of constant warfare with Rome, the looming threat of extinction, push Carthaginian society toward a darker interpretation of their own faith? Did the propaganda, in a cruel twist, help create the very reality it described? The enduring power of this myth has utterly shaped Carthage's legacy. For 2,000 years, the name Carthage has been synonymous with cruelty, a byword for a civilization that broke the most sacred taboo. It has allowed us to comfortably other them, to place them safely outside the bounds of our own humanity. But what if we are wrong? What if the story we tell says more about our need for simple villains than it does about a complex, lost people? To question this myth is not to excuse potential atrocity, but to confront a harder truth. History is not a court of law, and the evidence is always fragmentary, always filtered through the lens of those who survived to write it down. The silence of the Carthaginians is almost total. We have their bones, their coins, their crumbling walls, but we have no history written in their own voice, no defense against the accusations. We are left listening to a ghost while the prosecutor's speech echoes through the ages. This leaves us with a responsibility far greater than choosing a side. We must learn to hold two conflicting truths at once, to see the ashes in the Tophet and hear the scorn in the Roman texts, and understand that the real Carthage is forever hidden in the shadow between them. This silence from Carthage itself makes every detail we think we know about its greatest son feel like a whisper passed through a dozen hostile mouths. Take the elephants. Hannibal Barca crossing the Alps with a herd of war elephants is the single most iconic image from the Punic Wars, a staggering feat of logistics and daring that has echoed for over 2,000 years. Our minds instantly conjure the giants of the African savanna, those immense creatures with enormous ears and long, curving tusks, but that popular picture is almost certainly wrong. The logistics alone make it nearly impossible. African bush elephants are notoriously resistant to training for warfare. They are larger, more temperamental, and lack the long history of domestication for such purposes. Getting just one of these multi-ton beasts across the Rhone River, let alone up the icy, narrow paths of the Alps, would have been a nightmare far beyond even Hannibal's legendary capabilities. So what kind of elephant did he actually use? The answer reshapes the entire endeavor. Hannibal's elephants were almost certainly the now extinct North African forest elephant. Smaller than their bush cousins, standing about 8 feet at the shoulder compared to over 10, these animals were more manageable, native to the woodlands of North Africa from Morocco to Tunisia, right in Carthage's backyard. Ancient coins minted in Carthage itself depict elephants with relatively small ears and a distinct saddle-like back, features that match descriptions of these forest elephants better than the giants of the sub-Saharan plains. They were a local resource familiar to his mahout drivers, and their smaller size made the impossible journey merely extraordinarily difficult. But there is another, even more intriguing possibility. Carthage's vast trade network stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. They would have had access to Asian elephants through intermediaries in the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. Asian elephants have been used in warfare for millennia and are famously more trainable. Could Hannibal have supplemented his North African herd with a few of these imported animals? Ancient sources are frustratingly vague, using the generic Greek word for elephant without distinguishing species. Some of the descriptions of the crossing, however, hint at the animals suffering in the cold, which aligns more with the physiology of an Asian or North African forest elephant than one adapted to the varied climates of Africa. This is not just academic trivia about zoology. Getting the elephant right changes how we see the man and the mission. Imagine the scene not with hulking behemoths, but with agile, intelligent creatures the size of large horses, their backs draped in colorful blankets, trudging through snow they had never seen before. It makes the crossing slightly more plausible, yet in many ways even more remarkable. It speaks to Hannibal's meticulous planning. He did not just grab any elephant. He selected the right tool for an impossible job, understanding the limitations and strengths of the animals at his command. The choice of elephant reveals the mind of a master tactician thinking several moves ahead, even before the first mountain was climbed. This small correction to our mental image does not diminish his achievement. If anything, it enhances it. It replaces a cartoonish spectacle with a sharper, more human reality. It was not a parade of monsters invading Europe, but a calculated gamble using the best available technology, a gamble that very nearly changed the course of the Western world. The true wonder is not that he used elephants, but that he got any elephants across those peaks at all. The image of salted earth is one of history's most chilling finales. After the last stones of Carthage were torn down and its people sold into slavery, the story goes, the Romans performed one last act of spite. They plowed the ruins and sowed the fields with salt, cursing the very ground so that nothing would ever grow again. It is the ultimate symbol of annihilation, a declaration that not only a city, but its memory and its future were to be erased from the earth. This poetic, brutal ending feels right. It matches the scale of Rome's hatred and the totality of the victory. There is just one profound problem with it: it almost certainly never happened. To understand why, we must listen to the voices closest to the event. Polybius, the Greek historian who was actually present at the siege of Carthage, provides a detailed eyewitness account of the city's final days. He describes the horrible scenes of destruction, the fires burning for days, the systematic looting, but he never once mentions salt, neither does any other contemporary Roman or Greek source. For an act meant to be a grand, symbolic gesture of eternal vengeance, it is strikingly absent from the historical record. The practical reasons for this silence are even more convincing. Salting the earth as a tactic to ruin farmland was a known practice in the ancient world, but it was a local, targeted measure. To salt the vast agricultural hinterland that fed a metropolis like Carthage would have been a logistical nightmare of absurd proportions. Carthage was a city of several 100,000 people. The amount of salt required to poison even a fraction of its fertile plains would have been staggering, requiring a fleet of ships and thousands of laborers for months. And for what purpose? The Romans were not fools. They were pragmatists. Within a generation, they realized the strategic and economic value of that exact location. Less than 30 years after the destruction, Gaius Gracchus proposed rebuilding a colony on the site. While his plan initially failed, the Roman colony of Junonia was eventually founded there by Julius Caesar, and under Augustus it flourished as a major provincial capital, one of the largest cities in the empire. You do not deliberately poison land you intend to resettle and profit from. So where did this powerful myth come from? Its roots appear centuries later, likely in the medieval or Renaissance periods. Scholars tracing the phrase find it popping up in texts from the 19th century, used as a vivid metaphor for the totality of Carthage's defeat. It seems to be a later invention, a piece of historical poetry that retroactively fitted the perceived depth of Roman hatred. It perfectly encapsulated the concept of scorched earth in a single, unforgettable image. The myth persists because it feels truer than the truth. The factual end of Carthage was brutal enough, a city dismantled stone by stone, its citizens enslaved, its very name forbidden from being spoken in rituals of peace. But that is administrative, cold. Salting the earth is visceral. It speaks to a hatred that goes beyond politics and war, a hatred that seeks to attack life itself. It transforms Rome's victory from a military action into a kind of mythological curse, which is how we have often preferred to remember it. This reveals a fascinating truth about how history is shaped. Sometimes the stories we create to explain the past become more powerful than the events themselves. The myth of the salt gives us a moral clarity that the messy, pragmatic reality does not. It allows us to point to a single, definitive act of ending, but history is rarely so neat. Carthage was not erased by salt, but by time, propaganda, and the slow forgetting that follows conquest. The land defiantly never stopped being fertile. The Romans proved that by building their own glorious city upon the ashes, a city that would one day fall to other conquerors in an endless, unsalted cycle of rise and ruin. The fertile fields of Carthage's hinterland fed its people, but its survival demanded a far sharper tool than a plow. To dismiss the Carthaginians as mere merchants, as shopkeepers who just happened to own a navy, is to fundamentally misunderstand the engine of their empire. Their wealth was built on trade, but that wealth was protected by a military machine of terrifying efficiency and innovation. This was not a civilization of pacifist accountants. It was a state that understood power as a balance sheet of both gold and blood, and for centuries their ledger was overwhelmingly in the black. Their military structure was unique, a direct reflection of their commercial priorities. A standing citizen army like Rome's would have pulled young men away from the vital work of commerce and colonization, so Carthage developed a professional hybrid model. The core leadership, the officer corps, and the formidable cavalry was drawn from the Carthaginian aristocracy itself. These were the sons of merchant princes, raised with the same strategic acumen they applied to business, now directed on the battlefield. They provided the brain and the elite strike force of the army. The bulk of the infantry, however, was hired. Carthage's vast treasury allowed it to recruit the finest warriors from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Disciplined Iberian swordsmen, fierce Balearic slingers, nimble Numidian horsemen, and solid Gallic infantry. This was not a weakness in itself, it was a calculated strength. It meant Carthage could field a diverse, professional army tailored to specific campaigns without depleting its own civilian population. This system produced military geniuses who could orchestrate these polyglot forces with devastating effect. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, was a master of guerrilla warfare in the brutal mountains of Sicily and Spain. But it is his son, Hannibal, who delivered the masterpiece that forever shattered the myth of Carthaginian military inferiority. The Battle of Cannae is still studied in war colleges today, a chilling symphony of tactical deception. Facing a massive Roman army that far outnumbered his own, Hannibal did not meet strength with strength. He used the Romans' own aggression against them. He placed his weakest Gallic and Iberian infantry in a convex arc at his center and ordered them to slowly give ground. The Roman legions, seeing what they thought was a breakthrough, pushed eagerly into the bulge, funneling themselves deeper into the Carthaginian line. They were driving into a trap. As the Roman formation compressed, Hannibal's veteran African infantry, positioned on the flanks, turned inward like two great doors swinging shut. At the same moment, his unmatched Numidian cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, slammed into the rear of the packed Roman mass. The Roman army was completely surrounded, pressed so tightly that most soldiers could not even lift their weapons. It was not a battle, it was systematic annihilation. In a single afternoon, Hannibal's mercenary army executed a perfect double envelopment, killing perhaps 50,000 Romans. This was not the work of a simple merchant. This was the work of one of history's supreme military minds, commanding a tool forged by Carthage's unique system. Yet, that very system contained the seeds of disaster. A mercenary army is loyal to its paymaster, not to a flag or a homeland. When the pay was late or a campaign ended, these armies could become a mortal threat to the state that hired them. This happened catastrophically after the First Punic War, when unpaid mercenaries and disgruntled Libyan subjects rose in a bloody, 3-year rebellion that brought Carthage itself to the brink of destruction. It was a civil war more devastating than the conflict with Rome that preceded it, and it exposed the core vulnerability of their model. In contrast, Rome's citizen soldiers were fighting for their own land, their own families. Their resilience and ability to absorb staggering losses were born from a different, more deeply rooted kind of loyalty. Carthage could buy skill and bravery, but it struggled to buy the desperate, enduring spirit of a people defending their home. So the truth lies in the tension between these two facts. To call them only traders is absurd. They were warriors of the highest caliber, architects of some of the most brilliant maneuvers in military history. But their martial power was a brilliant, expensive, and ultimately fragile instrument, one that could win breathtaking victories in the field, yet crack under the immense, grinding pressure of a war for survival against a foe like Rome. Their genius was real, but so was the flaw that their wealth could never quite fix. Gold has a way of surviving even the most complete destruction. While Rome plundered Carthage and scattered its people, stories insist something priceless escaped the flames. Legends whisper that in the final, desperate days, priests or wealthy merchants smuggled the city's true wealth away, hiding vast treasures in secret locations across the Mediterranean. It is a romantic, irresistible idea, the lost treasure of Carthage, a final defiance against the conqueror, waiting in some sunken cave or desert oasis for a lucky soul to discover. The most famous of these tales swirls around the Barca family itself. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, carved out a virtual kingdom for Carthage in the silver-rich mountains of Spain. The family's personal fortune, built from those mines, must have been colossal. So where did it go? After Hannibal's final defeat and exile, the trail goes cold. Some speculate he used his wealth to fund his travels and maintain influence in the courts of the Eastern kingdoms. Others believe loyalists hid the Barca treasure, perhaps in a remote corner of Spain or even in the Alps, to fund a future war of liberation that never came. Then there are the tales of sacred artifacts. The most precious object in Carthage was said to be the legendary mantle of the goddess Tanit, a robe woven with threads of gold and adorned with priceless gems kept in her innermost temple. Could devout priests have smuggled this sacred relic to safety before the Roman legions breached the walls? Stories place it everywhere, from a forgotten temple in Sardinia to a sealed chamber beneath the sands of Libya. Modern treasure hunters have latched onto these legends, often pointing to mysterious shipwrecks found along ancient trade routes. A wreck off Sicily with a cargo of silver ingots, or another near Malta with unusual Phoenician-style anchors, immediately sparks speculation. Could this be a treasure ship fleeing the siege? The cold water of reality, however, is less kind to these dreams. Historians examining the brutal facts of Carthage's end find the treasure myth largely implausible. The city was under a relentless 3-year siege. The Roman blockade by sea was absolute. Slipping a single ship laden with tons of gold and silver past the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean would have been a feat rivaling Hannibal's Alpine crossing. More importantly, by the final years, Carthage was financially exhausted. The war indemnities demanded by Rome after the Second Punic War were crippling, paid in annual installments of silver that drained the treasury for decades. The wealth of the state was spent on rebuilding its military and then on the very war that destroyed it. When the Romans finally sacked the city, they conducted a systematic, official looting over days, cataloging and shipping everything of value back to Rome. The historical record is clear. The victory yielded so much gold, silver, and loot that it eliminated Roman property taxes for years. They took it all. So why does the legend persist with such power? Because the idea of lost treasure fulfills a deep narrative need. The total victory of Rome feels too absolute, too final. The treasure myth provides a sliver of hope that something of the old Carthage evaded the conqueror's grasp. It transforms a historical tragedy into an unfinished story, a puzzle with a missing piece. It allows Carthage to have a secret, a last laugh from beyond the grave. In a way, the real treasure wasn't gold, but legacy, and that was something the Romans, for all their salt and fire, could never completely loot or melt down. The dream of hidden Carthaginian gold pales beside an even grander fantasy of discovery. One of the most persistent fringe theories insists that Carthaginian sailors, masters of the Mediterranean, accomplished the impossible long before the Vikings or Columbus. They crossed the Atlantic. Imagine the appeal. It rewrites the entire narrative of human exploration, placing a mysterious, lost civilization at the heart of the New World story. Proponents of this idea point to tantalizing clues. They cite reports of ancient Carthaginian coins unearthed in North America, and they pore over old maps, seeing the outline of Brazil in vague shapes drawn by classical geographers. The most famous piece of so-called evidence is the Paraíba inscription, a stone reportedly found in Brazil in the 1870s that bore a Phoenician text describing a storm-tossed voyage from a land beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It was a sensation, and then it was revealed as a rather clumsy hoax. The alleged coins, when examined by experts, almost always turn out to be misidentified artifacts from other eras or outright forgeries. No genuine Carthaginian artifact has ever been found in the Americas under controlled, verifiable archaeological conditions. This is the bedrock problem. We have to separate what we want to be true from what the evidence demands. The Carthaginians were undoubtedly phenomenal sailors. Their vessels were sturdy, their knowledge of stars and currents profound. They likely sailed down the coast of West Africa, and some evidence suggests they may have reached the British Isles for tin. But the Atlantic is a different beast entirely. The journey from West Africa to the coast of Brazil, while theoretically possible on the equatorial currents, is a voyage of over 1,600 miles of open ocean with no sight of land. It requires a ship and a supply system capable of sustaining a crew for months, with no guarantee of a return trip. There is no evidence Carthaginian ships were built or provisioned for such an ordeal. Their maritime excellence was coastal and Mediterranean, a mastery of known waters, not a reckless plunge into the absolute unknown. So why does this myth hold such power? It speaks to a deep human desire to connect dots, to find hidden patterns and lost chapters. It makes the world feel more mysterious, more interconnected than our textbooks allow. The silence of the Carthaginians themselves fuels this. Because they left no first-hand histories, we can project almost anything onto that blank canvas. The myth of pre-Columbian contact is ultimately a story about us. It reflects our modern longing to correct what we see as the arrogance of the traditional historical narrative, to elevate the overlooked and give credit to those history has forgotten. In a way, it is a continuation of the same impulse that created the monster myths. We are still trying to define Carthage, but now we want to make them heroes, pioneers, and secret discoverers. The truth, however, is likely more grounded and in its own way more impressive. The Carthaginians did not need to cross the Atlantic to be remembered as some of the ancient world's greatest explorers. Their real voyages across the treacherous Mediterranean and down the frightening coast of Africa were daring enough. They built a commercial empire without a map, using skill, courage, and calculation. That legacy does not require a fantasy of transatlantic glory. It stands firmly on the shores of the world they actually knew. Beneath the sun-bleached stones of the ruined city, another world was said to wait. Legends speak of a vast, hidden Carthage that survived the fires above, a labyrinth of tunnels, secret chambers, and echoing halls deep underground. This myth of a subterranean metropolis taps into a universal fascination with what lies hidden below our feet, a place where the city's true secrets and perhaps even its people escaped Rome's wrath. It is a powerful fantasy, but to understand its origin, we must descend from the realm of rumor into the actual, excavated dark. Archaeologists have indeed found an extensive network beneath Carthage, but it is not a hidden city. It is the city's vital, functioning guts. The most famous of these structures are the immense cisterns of La Malga, often romantically called Hannibal's cisterns. This was not a secret refuge, but a masterpiece of public engineering. Imagine a vast, open-air rectangular reservoir lined with waterproof cement, capable of holding millions of gallons of water channeled from distant springs via the Zaguan aqueduct. Adjacent to it were rows of long, vaulted, underground chambers for filtration and storage. Walking into one of these chambers is an awe-inspiring experience. The scale is monumental, the air cool and still, the ceiling supported by endless rows of arches receding into shadow. It feels like a cathedral built for water, a silent, subterranean testament to the city's need and its ingenuity. Alongside these cisterns ran sophisticated sewer systems, drains, and underground quarries where the soft sandstone bedrock was mined to build the city above. These interconnected, man-made caverns are the kernel of truth. For a medieval traveler or a Renaissance antiquarian poking through the overgrown ruins, stumbling into one of these dark, echoing spaces would have been a profound shock. Here was evidence of a scale and complexity they could barely comprehend. It was easy to extrapolate, to imagine that if these few chambers existed, they must connect, they must lead somewhere, that the entire hill was hollow. The myth was born from a misunderstanding of infrastructure. There is no evidence of residential spaces, temples, or forums down there, no signs of a parallel, hidden society. These were functional spaces for water, waste, and stone. Yet, the idea of a secret underground Carthage persists because it serves a deep psychological need. It offers a form of poetic justice. If Rome could not tolerate a rival on the earth, then perhaps Carthage simply moved its heart below, surviving in myth if not in fact. This trope is common in the stories of many lost civilizations, from tunnels beneath the pyramids to legendary cities like Agartha. It allows a culture to have a second, invisible life, preserving its mystery from the clumsy hands of historians and conquerors alike. The real underground Carthage is perhaps more impressive than the fantasy. It reveals a people who mastered their environment not with magic but with mathematics and labor, who ensured their city's survival by thinking in 3 dimensions, harnessing the earth itself to sustain the life above. The whispers of a hidden metropolis are a tribute to that ingenuity, even if they mistake the plumbing for a palace. That same symbol, the simple triangle crowned with a circle and a horizontal line, is carved into thousands of stone markers across the sacred Tophet. For centuries, this emblem was read as a brand of horror, the signature of a goddess who demanded innocent blood. Tanit, the chief deity of Carthage, has been imprisoned in this grim story, reduced in our imagination to a bloodthirsty demon presiding over unspeakable rites. But to see her only through that lens is to accept the propaganda of her enemies and miss the profound complexity of the divine figure who truly watched over the city. Her evolution tells a different story. She began not as a distinct Carthaginian invention, but as a local interpretation of a much older, widely revered Phoenician goddess, Astarte. Astarte was a powerful figure of fertility, sexuality, and warfare, a celestial queen. As Carthage grew into its own power, its people began to elevate Tanit, initially a lesser aspect or consort, to a position of supreme authority alongside the older god Baal-Hamon. This was a theological declaration of independence. By championing Tanit, Carthage was asserting its unique identity, separating its spiritual destiny from the older Phoenician homeland. Her prominence speaks to her central role in everyday life, far beyond any single grim ritual. Tanit was a goddess of staggering breadth. She was a protector in battle, invoked by soldiers and generals alike. Yet she was equally a goddess of the heavens and the moon, governing the rhythms of the sky and the seas. Most importantly, she was a nurturing mother goddess, a bestower of fertility for the land, for livestock, and for families. Her symbol itself is a subject of deep interpretation. Some see it as a stylized figure with raised arms, a universal gesture of prayer and blessing. Others view the triangle as a simple robe or a loaf of bread, a circle as a head, and the line as arms outstretched. It is an icon of a benevolent, welcoming presence, not a monstrous one. This symbol was everywhere on household items, on city gates, on jewelry, and of course on the markers in the Tophet. If that sacred space was indeed a cemetery for children, then Tanit's symbol there takes on a profoundly different meaning. She becomes not a consumer of souls, but a divine guardian, a celestial mother receiving the youngest and most vulnerable into her care for eternity. Her demonization was a deliberate two-stage process. First, the Romans, in their campaign to vilify everything Carthaginian, merged her with their own darkest concepts of foreign, evil deities. Then, centuries later, early Christian writers, seeking to discredit all pagan religions as demonic, completed the transformation. they recast Tanit as a malevolent spirit, a succubus or a witch, weaving her into tales of temptation and evil. This religious slander was a potent tool. By turning a civilization's beloved protector into a monster, you invalidate their entire worldview, their morality, and their right to exist. It justified not just military conquest, but cultural and spiritual erasure. The real Tanit was a reflection of the society that worshipped her, complex, strategic, nurturing, and fiercely protective. To reduce her to a one-dimensional monster is to lose a vital key to understanding the Carthaginian heart and mind. She was the face of their hopes for abundance, their plea for protection in a dangerous world, and their faith in a cosmic order that cared for them from the heavens down to the quiet, sacred ground where they laid their children to rest. Her true story is not one of horror, but of a people's love for a divine mother, a love so powerful their enemies felt compelled to twist it into a tale of fear. Their mastery of the sea seemed so complete it begged for a secret. How could Carthaginian ships vanish over the horizon for months, then return with uncanny precision, laden with riches from shores no one else could reliably find? For centuries, a tempting explanation has surfaced, one that grafts a medieval invention onto an ancient people. The 10th myth insists the Carthaginians possessed a magical tool, a primitive magnetic compass made from lodestone. It is a satisfying idea, a technological key that unlocks their maritime genius, but the truth of their navigation is both more human and more impressive, for they sailed the known world using nothing but their eyes, their courage, and a profound conversation with nature itself. The magnetic compass, as we understand it, simply did not exist in their world. The first reliable references to its use for navigation in the West do not appear until the 1200s in the Mediterranean of the Crusades. To give one to the Carthaginians is like giving a steam engine to the Romans, a dramatic anachronism born from our own inability to comprehend their skill without our own tools. So how did they do it? Their navigation was a symphony of observation, a deep literacy written in the sky and the sea. By day, they were masters of pilotage, staying within sight of land whenever possible. They knew every headland, every river mouth, every distinctive mountain peak from Spain to Sicily to the coast of Libya. They understood the colors of the water, which indicated depth and underwater hazards. They read the flight patterns of birds, knowing certain species would fly toward land at dusk. But their true genius emerged when the coastline faded and only the open sea remained. This is where the stars became their map. They were not just looking up, they were calculating. They knew the North Star, Polaris, as a fixed point in the northern sky, its height above the horizon giving them a rough sense of latitude. They tracked the movements of other constellations, understanding their seasonal shifts. The Phoenicians, their ancestors, are credited by some historians with teaching the Greeks the constellations of Ursa Minor and Major, the bears that circle the pole. At night, the captain or a dedicated navigator would have stood on deck, not with a sextant or a compass, but with a profound, memorized knowledge of the celestial clockwork, judging their east-west progress by the time certain stars rose or set. The wind itself was a character in their journey. They knew the seasonal patterns intimately, the steady summer northerlies of the Mediterranean, the treacherous shifts of the autumn. A famous example of their daring, and the document that lets us glimpse their methods, is the Periplus of Hannibal. This was not a myth but a real account, likely inscribed on a temple wall in Carthage and later translated by the Greeks. It describes an expedition led by the navigator Hannibal, sailing south beyond the Pillars of Hercules, down the terrifying west coast of Africa. The text is a marvel of practical observation mixed with awe. Hannibal notes the founding of colonies, the sighting of crocodiles and hippos in rivers, and the terrifying encounter with what he calls gorillas, likely large apes or tribespeople. He describes a night filled with the inland smell of fire and the sound of drums, and a day when the coast was obscured by a wall of flame, possibly a massive savanna fire. Crucially, he gives distances not in abstract miles but in sailing days. This was their true unit of measurement, a combination of time, observed speed, and the feel of the wind in the sails. They used sounding leads to measure depth and bring up samples of the seabed, mud, sand, or shells, which told an experienced sailor exactly where he was even when the land was invisible in fog. So where did the compass myth come from? It stems from a very modern confusion. We live in a world of GPS and digital charts where the idea of crossing an ocean without instrumental guidance seems almost supernatural. We look back at their achievements like Hanno's voyage into the unknown, and we cannot reconcile it with our own dependence on technology. Our minds supply a missing piece, a secret device that explains their confidence. We want their success to be due to a gadget because that is something we can understand and replicate. But their real tool was intangible, a living library of experience passed from captain to apprentice over generations. It was a gut feeling for the sea, honed into a science. It was the accumulated courage of 1,000 voyages, where a mistake in reading the stars or the currents could mean death. To credit them with a compass is in a strange way to diminish them. It reduces their monumental accomplishment to a simple matter of hardware. The reality is far more compelling. They did not conquer the Mediterranean with a piece of magnetized rock, but with a towering intellect applied to the natural world. Their navigation was not a secret technology, but a public, practiced art so advanced that to their land-bound rivals it might as well have been magic. And in that gap between understanding and wonder, myths are always born. That profound literacy of the natural world did nothing to shield them from the darkest slanders of their enemies. If child sacrifice was the ultimate moral crime, then the accusation of ritual cannibalism was the final, unthinkable step into absolute barbarism. A handful of ancient sources, always hostile and never eyewitnesses, whisper that certain Carthaginian rites involved consuming human flesh. These stories are vague, lurid, and exist in the same shadowy realm as tales of blood-drinking cults and demonic feasts. It is crucial to state this plainly. There is not a single shred of credible archaeological evidence to support it. No butchering marks on human bones from sacred sites, no cooking pits in temples, no artistic depictions, no first-hand accounts from anyone who claimed to have seen it. This myth is not history, it is psychological warfare, a weaponized story designed to break the last possible thread of empathy between the accuser and the accused. To understand its power, we must see it not as a unique charge against Carthage, but as part of a timeless propaganda playbook. The ancient Greeks famously used the term barbarian, not just for those who spoke another language, but for those they believed lived outside the laws of civilization and nature. They spread stories of distant tribes who were cannibals, not as factual ethnography, but as a way to define the boundary between us and them. The monstrous other dwells beyond the pale, and their imagined practices justify their conquest or exclusion. The Romans employed this same brutal logic. In their early persecutions of Christians, one of the most persistent and damaging rumors was that believers practiced Theastian feasts, a coded reference to cannibalism, born from a twisted misunderstanding of the ritual of the Eucharist. To an outsider hearing of consuming the body and blood of Christ, the metaphor could be horrifyingly literal. This slander was effective because it tapped into a deep, primal revulsion, making the targeted group seem not just wrong, but inhumanly dangerous, a cancer within the body of the empire that needed to be cut out. The Carthaginian cannibalism myth operates on exactly the same frequency. By the time of the Punic Wars, Rome was not just fighting a rival empire, it was fighting for its own survival against a foe that had brought legion after legion to ruin. Hannibal was at the gates, a nightmare made real. How do you motivate a population to endure such existential fear, to support a war to the bitter, total end? You dehumanize the enemy completely. You transform them from strategic adversaries into literal monsters. the accusation of cannibalism is the ultimate dehumanization. It strips away all shared humanity, all possible common ground. A people who eat human flesh are no longer people, they are beasts in human form, and beasts must be exterminated for the safety of all. This was not about reporting a cultural practice, it was about manufacturing a moral imperative for genocide. It made the eventual destruction of Carthage not an act of brutal imperialism, but a necessary sanitation, a cleansing of a spiritual plague from the earth. The silence of the evidence is deafening. Carthage has been excavated for over a century by teams of archaeologists. They have found temples, homes, shops, docks, and graves. They have found the bones of animals prepared for meals and the bones of humans laid respectfully to rest. Never have they found the systematic, ritualized proof of cannibalism that such a widespread practice would inevitably leave behind. The myth persists not because it has basis, but because it serves a narrative purpose even today. It is the final, shocking detail in the caricature of the savage Carthaginian, the perfect closing argument for a civilization we have been taught to see as irredeemably dark. But when we pull back and see this accusation in the long, grim history of slander, a pattern emerges. The charge of cannibalism is less a description of the accused and more a confession of the accuser's deepest fears and their ruthless need to dominate. It tells us that Rome, for all its legions and laws, feared Carthage enough to try and erase its very humanity from memory. And in that desperate act of character assassination, we see not the proof of Carthage's barbarism, but the stunning measure of its power. The accusation of cannibalism was a weapon of pure psychological terror, but the Romans who wielded it were not immune to a deeper, more haunting fear. In the centuries that followed Carthage's erasure, as the Republic tore itself apart in a spiral of civil war, political murder, and social collapse, a disturbing idea took root. Perhaps the true horror was not what they had destroyed, but what they had unleashed by destroying it. This is the 12th myth, the curse of Carthage, a belief that the act of annihilation placed a supernatural hex upon Rome itself, a poison in the soil of the empire that would blight its future for generations. It is a story the Romans began to tell themselves, a metaphysical explanation for their own self-inflicted wounds. The pattern seemed too stark to ignore. Scipio Aemilianus, the general who oversaw Carthage's final destruction, wept as he watched the city burn, quoting Homer about the inevitable fall of Troy and foreseeing a similar fate for his own homeland. Within a generation, the fabric of the Roman Republic began to violently unravel. The idealistic reformers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who championed the poor and challenged the senatorial elite, were both murdered by political rivals, their bodies thrown into the Tiber River. Their deaths marked the first time Roman citizens were killed in political violence in centuries, shattering an unspoken taboo. Then came the social war, the bloody revolt of Rome's Italian allies, followed by the brutal civil wars between Marius and Sulla, which saw proscription lists, street battles, and the first march of a Roman army on Rome itself. To a society steeped in religion and omens, this cascade of catastrophe felt like more than bad luck. It felt like a reckoning. Later historians and poets, writing with the benefit of hindsight, began to connect these dots with a single, sinister line. They suggested that in extinguishing Carthage, Rome had committed a profound sacrilege. They had violated the concept of Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. By showing such utter ruthlessness, by refusing to leave even a memory of a rival, they had invited divine retribution. The curse was not about ghosts or haunted battlefields. It was about a moral and spiritual corruption that seeped into the victor's soul. The historian Sallust, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, argued this point explicitly. He claimed that after the removal of the fear of Carthage, the path to vice was opened. With no great external enemy to unite against, Roman ambition turned inward, fueled by greed, luxury, and a lust for personal power that consumed the state. The curse was not a spell cast by dying Carthaginian priests. It was the inevitable outcome of unchecked imperialism and the immense corrupting wealth it brought. The connection to figures like the Gracchi is particularly poignant. The Gracchi brothers were seen by their supporters as martyrs for justice and by their enemies as dangerous radicals. Later traditions sometimes framed their tragic ends as part of the curse's working, as if the violence used against Carthage had created a template for political murder at home. Their proposed reforms, including the redistribution of public land, were sparked by the social inequalities that the new imperial wealth had exacerbated. In a very real sense, the problems they tried to solve were direct consequences of Rome's post-Carthage dominance. So the curse of Carthage is a powerful myth because it blends supernatural dread with acute political observation. It gave a name and a narrative to the Romans' own creeping sense of guilt and decline. It was easier to blame a mystical hex than to confront the uncomfortable truth that their republican system, forged in a world of external threats, was fundamentally incapable of managing the empire it had won. The curse provided a poetic, fatalistic framework for understanding their own descent into tyranny and chaos. It allowed them to be both the architects of their own doom and the victims of a darker, older magic. In the end, the curse was a story Rome told to make sense of its own sins. It was an admission that some victories are so complete they hollow out the victor. The true haunting was not by Carthaginian spirits, but by the ghost of the republic they had sacrificed on the altar of their own absolute power. The curse was a story Rome told itself, but the fear had a face and a name. Long after the last stone of Carthage was ground to dust, that name still echoed in the quiet hills of Italy. In the regions around Lake Trasimene and the plains of Cannae, local folklore for centuries whispered that the ghost of Hannibal Barca rode through the night. On certain foggy evenings, they said, you could hear the distant trumpet call, the phantom thunder of hooves, and see the shadow of a general on a dark horse surveying the fields where he forged a nation's nightmare. This is not history, but something perhaps more telling, the afterlife of trauma in a landscape. For 15 years, Hannibal was not just an enemy general, he was the boogeyman at the gates, a personal demon for every Roman citizen. He slaughtered their armies on their own soil, humiliated their proudest institutions, and camped within sight of the city walls, a haunting presence they could not exorcise. The military threat eventually faded, but the psychological scar remained, so deep it bled into the very soil and sprouted as legend. These ghost stories are a form of folk memory, a way for a community to process a collective shock too profound to be forgotten. They personify a national anxiety, giving it a shape that can be seen and a story that can be told around a fire. Hannibal's ghost is not a Carthaginian spirit, it is a Roman creation, the embodiment of their own vulnerability. He becomes a permanent feature of the landscape, a restless genius forever bound to the site of his greatest triumph, a reminder that some victories are so complete they conquer the victor's peace of mind. This pattern repeats across history. England has its spectral Viking raiders seen off stormy coasts. The American South once told tales of ghostly Union soldiers marching on old roads. These are not memories of glory, but of invasion, defeat, and fear. The ghost of the enemy is a cultural coping mechanism. By keeping the adversary alive in story, even as a frightening apparition, a people acknowledge the depth of the wound and in a strange way claim ownership over the memory. They are saying, this happened here to us, and the land itself has not forgotten. Hannibal's spectral rides ensure that the terror of those years is never fully laid to rest, that the shadow of the stranger from across the sea remains a part of Italy's own story, forever pacing the borders between history and myth. The ghost of Hannibal rides through Italian folklore, but the true spectre haunting Rome was the color of his wealth. Carthage's legendary fortune was not just built on silver or grain, but on a color so rare and radiant it became synonymous with power itself. This is the 14th myth, the story of a secret Carthaginian blue dye spun from the ink of a mysterious, extinct sea creature. While the tale of a lost azure hue is compelling, the reality is both more grounded and more extraordinary, rooted in a single, precious source that stained the hands of its makers and the robes of emperors. The treasure was Tyrian purple, and its story begins not in a vat but in the murky depths of the Mediterranean. To call it merely purple is an injustice. The dye produced from the mucus glands of the murex sea snail was a spectrum of crimson, violet, and deep, rich burgundy, a color that seemed to hold sunlight within it. The process of obtaining it was as difficult as the result was magnificent. Thousands of snails were harvested, their shells cracked to extract a tiny gland that produced a milky, yellowish secretion. This secretion, when exposed to sunlight and air through a complex, weeks-long fermentation process, underwent a miraculous transformation. It would shift from yellow to green, then to blue, and finally settle into that famous, indelible purple. The smell was legendary, a pungent, fishy reek so overpowering that dye workshops were always located downwind of cities. It took roughly 12,000 snails to produce a single gram of pure dye, enough to color only the trim of a garment. This staggering labor is what made the color worth more than its weight in silver, a luxury so extreme that sumptuary laws in Rome eventually restricted its use to the imperial family alone. So where does the myth of a separate, secret blue come from? It likely springs from two sources. First, the dyeing process itself was an alchemical art. The final hue depended on a dizzying number of factors: the species of murex used, the exact duration of sun exposure, the mineral content of the water, and the type of mordant used to fix the dye to the wool. A master dyer could manipulate these variables to produce a range of shades, from a reddish crimson to a bluer violet. A batch that leaned toward the violet end of the spectrum, especially after centuries of fading on a fragment of textile or in a painted fresco, could easily be misinterpreted as a distinct blue. Secondly, the Carthaginians were masters of trade secrets. Their entire economy depended on controlling knowledge, from navigation routes to dye recipes. They would have guarded their precise methods with lethal seriousness. In the ancient world, such intense secrecy naturally breeds speculation. When a process is hidden, the imagination fills the void with wonders. The idea that they possessed an even rarer, more secret color, one lost to time when their workshops were destroyed, is a romantic answer to a simple question of chemistry and fading light. The true power of Tyrian purple was not just in its beauty, but in what it represented. To wear it was to wear the sea, the sun, and the labor of thousands, distilled into a single, striking statement. It was a walking ledger of empire, a visible proof of a network that stretched from rocky coastlines to the shoulders of kings. When Carthage fell, Rome did not abandon the color. It eagerly seized the dye houses and the trade, donning the purple of its vanquished rival as the ultimate trophy. The myth of a lost blue speaks to our longing for that which is permanently beyond reach, for a knowledge so complete it died with its creators. But we need no mythical mollusk to be astonished. The humble murex snail, processed with a stinking, meticulous art, gave the ancient world a color worth going to war over, a color that outlived the city that perfected it, and still today whispers of an empire built on the slow, secret alchemy of the sea. The deep, resonant purple of royalty was a testament to their earthly power, but their gods demanded monuments on an entirely different scale. Ancient historians, writing long after the city's fall, described a terrifying centerpiece to Carthage's most sacred rituals. They claimed a colossal bronze statue of the god Baal-Hamon stood in the city, its arms outstretched and angled downward, palms upturned over a fiery pit. A child placed upon those metal hands would roll down the sloping arms and vanish into the flames below. It is a horrific, unforgettable image, a machine of sacrifice burned into the historical record. And like all potent images, it grew in the telling. medieval and Renaissance writers, looking back at these ancient descriptions through a lens of magic and lost wonders, began to wonder. Could such a statue have moved? Could it have been an ancient robot, a giant automaton powered by some forgotten science, its gears and pulleys hidden within the bronze? This evolution from a ritual artifact to a legendary machine reveals a fascinating truth about how we interpret the technological marvels of lost civilizations. First, we must ground ourselves in what the original sources likely described. The ancient Mediterranean world was no stranger to colossal statuary. The Greeks had mastered the art of large-scale bronze casting centuries before Carthage's peak. The famed Colossus of Rhodes, one of the Seven Wonders, was a bronze statue of the sun god Helios standing over 100 feet tall. Statues of deities 20 or 30 feet high were impressive, but not supernatural feats of engineering for the time. A large statue of Baal Hammon, cast in bronze with hollow arms angled like a slide, is entirely plausible from a technical standpoint. The fire pit beneath it would have been a simple, if grim, architectural feature. To a Roman or Greek observer, perhaps seeing the city in ruins or hearing tales from prisoners, the combination would have been shocking but not mechanically inexplicable. It was a powerful piece of religious theater designed to awe and intimidate, using the most advanced materials of the age to manifest divine presence. The leap from a stationary statue to a living, moving giant is where the myth truly takes flight. This transformation happens in the imagination of later cultures who had lost the direct knowledge of classical metalworking techniques. By the Middle Ages, the ability to cast such immense, hollow bronze figures had largely faded in Europe. When scholars read classical accounts of giant statues that seemed to interact with rituals, they filtered them through their own world of wonder. They knew of ancient tales like those from Homer, where the god Hephaestus created golden maidens who could think and move. They heard rumors of automata in the Byzantine and Arab worlds, clever clockwork devices that mimicked life. Faced with the description of Baal's statue, it was a small step to imagine it not as a passive slide, but as an active participant. Perhaps its arms moved to receive the offering. Perhaps its head turned or smoke issued from its mouth. In the absence of technical understanding, magic fills the gap. The statue becomes a golem, a bronze giant brought to life by dark rites, a perfect symbol for a civilization already painted as diabolical. This pattern repeats throughout history. Any sufficiently advanced or large-scale technology from a lost culture risks being reinterpreted as magic by those who come later. The massive stone blocks of Baalbek or the pyramids were said to be the work of giants or levitation spells. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer, was a baffling collection of gears when first discovered, so out of place it seemed almost alien. The Carthaginian bronze statue fits this pattern perfectly. Its very scale and its association with a mysterious, maligned ritual made it a prime candidate for mythologizing. It was easier for a medieval monk to believe in a demonic automaton than to conceive of the sophisticated furnace technology, the painstaking lost wax casting process, and the coordinated labor of hundreds required to actually build it. The myth of the living statue tells us less about Carthage and more about the human tendency to conflate the monumental with the miraculous. We look at the achievements of the past, and when we cannot see the fingerprints of the artisans, we assume the hand of a god or a demon. The real wonder is not that the statue could move, but that they could make something so immense and terrifyingly still, a frozen gesture of divine power that would haunt the memories of their enemies for 1,000 years. That bronze giant, frozen in a silent scream, was a monument to a god of a specific time and place. But some stories are not content with such simple origins. They reach further back into a deeper, more chaotic past and try to tie Carthage to the ultimate ancient mystery of the sea. The 16th myth is a chronological sleight of hand, a claim that the Carthaginians were the original sea peoples, that shadowy coalition of marauders who shattered the Bronze Age world around 1200 years before the Common Era. It is a seductive idea, linking one great maritime power to another, creating a lineage of eternal seafaring menace. The timeline, however, refuses to cooperate. Carthage was founded, according to traditional dating, around 814 years before the Common Era. That is a gap of roughly 4 centuries, a chasm of time as wide as the one between the fall of Rome and the voyages of Columbus. The sea peoples had come, raided, and vanished into the fog of history long before the first Carthaginian settlers laid a stone on Biasa Hill. So where does this persistent link come from? It springs from a tangled root, the shared Phoenician heritage. To understand, we must pull these threads apart. The sea peoples were not a single nation, but a confederation of groups with names like the Peliset, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen. They appear in the records of crumbling empires, most famously in the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III in Egypt. His inscriptions and reliefs show a great naval battle, a chaotic melee of strange ships and warriors with feathered headdresses repulsed from the Nile Delta. Their origins are hotly debated, with theories placing them from the Aegean, Anatolia, or the wider Mediterranean. What is clear is that their attacks, combined with other factors like climate change and internal revolt, helped catalyze the collapse of the Hittite Empire and severely weakened New Kingdom Egypt, plunging the Eastern Mediterranean into a dark age. Now enter the Phoenicians. In the wake of this very collapse, a group of coastal city-states in the Levant cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos began to rise. These were the Phoenicians, the master sailors and traders who would eventually send out colonies across the sea. They were not the sea peoples, but they were arguably their beneficiaries, emerging into a power vacuum left by the fallen Bronze Age giants. Centuries later, as Tyre grew powerful, it sent out its own colony to a promising harbor in North Africa, a colony named Carthage, the new city, Carthage. So the lineage is clear but distinct. The sea peoples were the destroyers of an old order. The Phoenicians were the builders who arose in the ashes. And Carthage was the most spectacular and distant offspring of those builders. Conflating them is like saying the Pilgrims on the Mayflower were Vikings, simply because both groups crossed the Atlantic. The myth persists because it feeds a deep human desire for neat, epic narratives. It is far more thrilling to imagine a single, ancient, oceanic bloodline of raiders and traders, a perennial menace haunting the Mediterranean from the age of pyramids to the age of the Roman Republic. It simplifies the messy, discontinuous reality of history into a single, sweeping saga, but the truth is more interesting. The sea peoples represent a catastrophic, system-ending event. The Phoenicians and their Carthaginian descendants represent the brilliant, opportunistic rebirth that can follow such an ending. One group tore the world down, the others learned to sail through the wreckage and build something new upon distant shores. To merge them is to lose the profound lesson of that cycle, the stark difference between an ending and a beginning that grew, centuries later, from its long-cooled embers. Fire is a weapon as old as war itself, but some flames become legends. Centuries after Carthage was dust, the Byzantine Empire wielded a terror on the waves called Greek fire, a liquid inferno that burned even on water and could not be extinguished. Its exact recipe died with the emperors of Constantinople, a secret so valuable that revealing it was treason. And in the echoing halls of myth, that secret sometimes slips backward in time, gifted to the other great naval power of antiquity. The 17th myth insists the Carthaginians possessed Greek fire long before the Byzantines, that their fleets commanded this unstoppable chemical weapon. It is a thrilling idea, a thread of hidden knowledge connecting two maritime superpowers across a 1,000-year gap, but history and chemistry tell a different story. The Carthaginians were masters of using fire in battle. but their methods were those of their age, brilliant applications of known technology, not supernatural secrets. Their most feared naval tactic was the fire ship. Imagine an old, crewless vessel loaded with dry tinder, pitch, and sulfur, set ablaze and sent drifting with the wind or current into an enemy fleet anchored in a harbor or packed tightly for battle. The panic alone was a weapon, as sailors faced the impossible choice of cutting anchors and scattering into disorder or being consumed by the floating bonfire. They also used incendiary arrows and pots filled with burning materials, standard tools in the ancient arsenal. These were devastating, but they were not Greek fire. The Byzantine weapon was something categorically different. Descriptions from its victims are haunting. It was a liquid, often projected from bronze tubes mounted on ships or walls that ignited as it sprayed. It clung to everything it touched: wood, water, flesh, and continued to burn with a ferocious intensity. Water seemed to feed it. It was likely a complex mixture of crude petroleum or naphtha, combined with resins, sulfur, and possibly quicklime, which ignites on contact with water. This was a precise, volatile alchemy, a state secret guarded with a paranoia that makes the Carthaginian dye formulas look like public knowledge. So why do we so easily gift this later marvel to the Carthaginians? The answer lies in a pattern of how we remember great powers. Dominant naval empires across time are often credited with wonder weapons by their terrified enemies and awed successors. The British had their dreaded ship of the line, the Spanish their galleons laden with silver, and in the ancient Mediterranean, any terrifying flame became synonymous with the master of the sea. When you are the supreme naval force, all fire at sea is, in a sense, your fire. The myth also satisfies a deep-seated narrative craving for continuity. We dislike historical loose ends. We want to believe that great discoveries are not lost, that they pass in a hidden lineage from one advanced culture to another. Giving Greek fire to Carthage creates a satisfying through line, a secret that travels from Phoenician chemists to Byzantine engineers, making the past feel more connected, more purposeful. But the archaeological record shows no tubes, no pressurized projectors, no chemical residues in Carthaginian harbors that match the profile of the Byzantine substance. Their incendiary power was real, but it was the power of ingenuity, not alchemy. They took the simple, terrifying element of fire and wielded it with strategic genius, which in many ways is more impressive. Anyone can guard a secret formula, but it takes a true master of the sea to turn a burning hulk of wood into a weapon that could decide the fate of an empire. The myth does them a strange disservice. It implies their victories required a magical advantage, rather than acknowledging the sheer tactical brilliance of commanders who could orchestrate chaos with nothing more than wind, current, and a well-timed spark. Their flames were mortal, but their cunning was the stuff of lasting legend. That tactical brilliance upon the waves has inspired some to chart their voyages onto maps where they never sailed. From the phantom fires of Greek fire, we drift north into colder, mistier waters, toward one of history's most iconic and misattributed monuments. The 18th myth insists that Carthaginian colonists not only reached the fog-shrouded Isle of ancient Britain, but that they built Stonehenge. It is a grand claim, weaving the mysterious sailors of the south into the very stones of the north, but it unravels under the simplest of tools, a calendar. The timeline is brutally dismissive. The great Sarsen stones of Stonehenge were erected around 2,500 years before the Common Era. Carthage, remember, was not even founded until roughly 814 B.C. The monument's main phase was already ancient, weathered by 2 millennia of rain and wind before the first Carthaginian child drew breath. To suggest they built it is like saying Christopher Columbus constructed the Roman Colosseum, a chronological impossibility of staggering scale. So where did this peculiar idea originate? It is a branch of the broader Phoenicians everywhere mythos, a 19th century fascination that sought to credit every advanced or mysterious structure in prehistoric Europe to wise, civilized travelers from the East. Victorian scholars, looking at the colossal stone circles scattered across Britain and France, could not reconcile their engineering with their image of the primitive, paint-daubed Celts described by Roman historians. Their solution was to look abroad to the famed seafarers of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, and by extension their Carthaginian successors, were perfect candidates, celebrated in classical literature as master builders and navigators. It was a theory born from a colonial-era mindset that was uncomfortable with the idea of independent, sophisticated development among so-called barbarian peoples of the North. If the natives could not have done it, a more civilized outsider must have shown them how. This does not mean, however, that Carthaginian ships never ventured into those northern seas. Evidence, while thin, suggests a tantalizing possibility of contact, though of a very different kind than colonizing builders. The Carthaginians craved tin, a vital component for making bronze, and one of the richest known sources in the ancient world was in Cornwall at the southwestern tip of Britain. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century B.C.E., vaguely mentions the Tin Islands somewhere far to the north beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It is plausible that Carthaginian merchants or middlemen from Atlantic-facing tribes in Spain or Gaul established a sporadic, indirect trade. A Carthaginian coin found in Dorset or a fragment of Mediterranean pottery in Cornwall would not be shocking, but such finds are exceptionally rare and often debated. This would have been the very end of a long, risky chain of barter, not the establishment of a bustling colony. Imagine a single ship, or more likely a series of handoffs between coastal tribes over hundreds of miles, finally bringing a few bars of precious Cornish tin to a Carthaginian factor in southern Spain. This is a far cry from an architect directing the placement of 80-ton bluestones. The romantic myth and the scant evidence represent two entirely different stories. One is a fable of lost civilizations and master builders, a neat answer to a mystery. The other is a story of economics, of raw materials moving along faint, dangerous lines of desire across a map mostly blank to those at the trade's origin. The real builders of Stonehenge were the people already there, ancestors of the Celts, whose understanding of astronomy, social organization, and sheer willpower we are only beginning to appreciate. To give their achievement away to distant sailors is to rob them of their own genius. It perpetuates the old, condescending idea that light and civilization must always flow from a recognized center, and that the periphery is incapable of its own wonders. The stones of Salisbury Plain stand as a testament to a different truth, that human brilliance can ignite independently in many places under many skies. The Carthaginians may have eventually heard whispers of those stones from traders, tales of a strange, circular temple in a land of mist and oak, but they were listeners to that mystery, not its authors. Their legacy is written in the sea lanes and the marketplace, not in the alignment of the solstice sun with a ring of granite they never saw. The stones of a foreign land could never speak for them, but their own words were twisted into something dark. After the legions departed and the ruins cooled, the true ghost of Carthage did not haunt battlefields, it lingered on the lips of the living. The Punic language, the tongue of Hannibal and the merchants of the Mediterranean, survived in North Africa for centuries after the city's physical death. Yet in the imagination of later ages, this survival took a sinister turn. The 19th myth whispers that Punic was no ordinary language, but a magical tongue of spells and curses, a linguistic weapon left behind by a vanquished demon people. This belief did not spring from nothing. It grew from the fertile, fearful ground where ignorance meets a bad reputation. To Roman ears, Punic would have sounded harsh and guttural, a cascade of strange consonants from deep in the throat. Its script derived from the Phoenician alphabet, bore no resemblance to elegant Latin or Greek letters. It was a series of cryptic, angular shapes. When you combine an unfamiliar, seemingly aggressive sound with a people you have spent generations painting as monstrous, the conclusion is almost inevitable. Their words must be as malevolent as their deeds. If they spoke in the tongues of demons, then their very language was a form of sorcery, a remaining fragment of the evil you thought you had destroyed. The reality of Punic was, of course, utterly mundane and profoundly human. It was a Semitic language, a close cousin to Hebrew and Phoenician, the everyday speech of markets, homes, and temples. Its survival is one of history's quiet rebellions. For hundreds of years, well into the Roman imperial period and beyond, Punic remained the common language of the rural hinterlands and many cities in North Africa. Farmers haggled in it, mothers sang lullabies in it, and local governors had to issue decrees in both Latin and Punic to be understood. The most striking testament comes from the Christian bishop Augustine of Hippo, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, over 500 years after Carthage fell. He preached in what is now Algeria, and in his writings he complains about the need for priests who could speak Punic to minister to their flocks. He even notes that the word for salvation in Punic was a simple term any local would know. This is not a language of dark incantations. It is the living, breathing speech of a people who adapted and endured, their identity persisting long after their political power was erased. So how did a language of farmers and priests become the stuff of sorcerers' manuals? The process is a classic recipe for myth-making. First, take something unknown and obscure. Then associate it with a culture already branded as evil or mysterious. Finally, let time and superstition do the rest. As the Roman Empire Christianized, the old pagan gods of all conquered peoples were demonized. Baal, Hammon, and Tanit were recast as devils in Christian theology. If their gods were demons, then the language used to worship them must be a demonic tongue. Fragments of Punic inscriptions found on weathered stones in forgotten places would have been utterly illegible to medieval monks or Arab scholars. They saw not historical records but sigils, runes, or magical formulae. A shopping list or a funeral dedication could easily be misinterpreted as a spell tablet or a curse meant to bind spirits. The unknown script became a blank screen onto which people projected their deepest fears and fascinations with the occult. This transformation reveals a universal human tendency. We often conflate linguistic difference with moral or spiritual danger. A language we do not understand can feel like a secret code, and a code used by a maligned people must contain forbidden knowledge. The myth of the magical Punic tongue is the final, subtle layer of Carthage demonization. It was not enough to destroy their city and vilify their gods. Even their most basic human attribute, their speech, had to be corrupted into something unnatural. It represents the ultimate othering, denying them even the normality of a common language. Yet, in a beautiful irony, the language itself stubbornly refused to vanish into fantasy. It lived on in place names, in loan words absorbed into Latin and later Arabic, and in the daily lives of millions who had never heard of Hannibal Barca. The magic was never in the words themselves, but in the power they held to connect a people to their past, a silent, resilient spell of memory that outlasted empires and outlived the lies told about it. A family name can be a heavier burden than any defeat. The Barcas were extinguished not just by war, but by a systematic Roman hunt for every last member of that cursed bloodline. Hannibal's brothers were killed in battle, his homeland was forbidden to him, and he died by his own hand in a distant eastern court, a fugitive to the end. With that, history records the line of the Lion of Carthage as severed, a tree ripped up by the roots, yet legends are not so easily pruned. The 20th myth is a whisper of survival, a persistent story that somewhere in the mountains of Spain, the deserts of North Africa, or the hidden valleys of the East, the true Barca lineage endured in secret. They were said to have married into local tribes, changed their names, and bided their time, guarding a sacred duty to one day rise and reclaim their stolen legacy. It is the ultimate revenge fantasy for a fallen hero, the rightful heir in exile, waiting in the shadows for their moment to restore a golden age. The emotional pull is undeniable. Hannibal's story is one of brilliant victory followed by agonizing, slow defeat, a tragedy on an epic scale. We want a better ending. We want to believe that something of his genius, his defiance, escaped the trap. The idea of secret bastards offers that comfort, a thread of hope that the story is not truly over. But we must separate the poetry of the myth from the parchment of the record. The historical fate of the bastards is clear, and it is final. After the Second Punic War, Rome's peace terms were explicitly designed to dismantle the Barca power base in Spain and eliminate the family as a political force. Hannibal spent his final decades as a wandering exile, a chess piece in the courts of the Hellenistic kings, always knowing Roman agents were closing in. His son, if he had one who survived infancy, vanishes from any reliable account. Other relatives were absorbed into the Roman world, their identities dissolved for safety or favor. Any direct descendants would have had every reason to conceal their ancestry, not to proclaim it. To be a Barca after Carthage was not to be a king in waiting, it was to be a walking target. So, could there be distant, anonymous descendants alive today? Almost certainly. The laws of genealogy make it statistically probable that Hannibal has living relatives, thousands of them, scattered across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Their blood is diluted through countless generations, mixed with that of Romans, Berbers, Spaniards, and Arabs. They are utterly unaware, their lives disconnected by 2 millennia from the general whose name they might never have heard. This is the quiet, biological truth, far removed from the myth of a secret dynasty guarding a flame. The powerful myth of the hidden heir speaks to a deeper pattern in how we process history. Great families, especially those who fall from a dramatic height, become legends. We see it with the lost princes of fallen kingdoms, the last descendants of the Romanovs or the Plantagenets, around whom conspiracy theories of survival always swirl. We see it in fiction, from Arthur Pendragon to the heirs of Gondor. This archetype fulfills a narrative hunger for justice and cyclical return. It suggests that history is not a random, messy sprawl, but a story with a hidden plot where the rightful order, violently interrupted, might one day be restored. Hannibal Barca, more than almost any historical figure, fits the mold of the tragic, romantic hero. He was a foreigner of immense talent who humbled a superpower, a man bound by an oath to his father and his gods, who ultimately could not overcome the relentless machinery of his enemy. We root for him. In rooting for him, we wish for his lineage to have outsmarted fate one last time. The myth allows us to believe that the brilliance was not truly extinguished, that it merely went to ground, waiting for a more favorable season that never came. In the end, the secret Barca bloodline is not a historical possibility, but a monument built from admiration. It is a story told by the fans of the underdog long after the game was over. The real bastards are gone, their political project finished, but the legend of their survival ensures that Hannibal never truly dies. He remains forever at the edges of the empire he challenged, a ghost in the historical imagination, still waiting just beyond the light of the campfire, his descendants forever just one generation away from returning to rewrite the ending. That legend of a hidden heir is a story of survival against impossible odds, a refusal to accept an ending. We see the same stubborn hope in a much grander geographical fantasy, one that pushes Carthage's imagined reach to the very bottom of the world. The 21st myth insists that Carthaginian explorers, in their voyages of supreme daring, not only crossed the Atlantic but sailed so far south they mapped a continent no human eyes would see again for over 1,000 years. According to this tale, their charts survived in secret, eventually influencing a famous and mysterious artifact, the Piri Reis map of 1513, which appears to show the coastline of Antarctica free of ice. This is the ultimate prize for the ancient advanced civilization theory, proof that a lost culture possessed knowledge that defies the accepted timeline of human discovery. The reality, however, is a masterclass in how a single misunderstanding can spawn an entire alternate history. Let us begin with the map itself. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. In his notes on the map's creation, he explicitly states he compiled it from about 20 source charts, including Portuguese, Arab, and even one captured from Christopher Columbus. He mentions ancient maps but never specifies Carthaginian ones. The section that sparks the frenzy is a landmass at the southern edge, jagged and strange. To modern eyes, it bears a passing resemblance to the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, a shape we only learned with 20th century sonar. The leap of faith is immediate and dramatic. How could a 16th century map show a continent buried under miles of ice, unless its source was from a time when Antarctica was ice-free, perhaps thousands of years before the Common Era? The conclusion seems inevitable. A lost, globally aware civilization must be the source. But scholarship offers a far more grounded and no less fascinating explanation. Look at the Piri Reis map as a whole. Its central focus is the Atlantic, with a reasonably accurate coast of Brazil and a wildly distorted Gulf of Mexico. That mysterious southern landmass is directly connected to South America. Most experts in historical cartography see it not as Antarctica, but as a speculative, unfinished representation of the southern continent geographers had long believed must exist to balance the landmasses of the north, terra australis incognita. More convincingly, it bears a striking resemblance to a badly mangled depiction of the eastern coast of South America, with the prominent bulge of Brazil twisted and duplicated. The so-called Antarctic coastline matches, point for point, features from the Rio de la Plata estuary and the coast of Patagonia, copied from Portuguese charts and then stretched, rotated, and merged with pure conjecture. There is no need for Ice Age Carthaginians, only for the ordinary errors of a compiler working with conflicting, fragmentary reports from a new and confusing world. So where are the lost Carthaginian maps that supposedly started this chain? They do not exist. Not a single fragment of a Carthaginian map has ever been found. We have written periply, sailing directions that list landmarks and days of travel, but these are textual logs, not scaled charts with latitudes. The entire edifice of this myth rests on a phantom, a source that is invoked but never produced. The ancient world's knowledge of the southern hemisphere was, frankly, minimal and mythic. Greek geographers like Ptolemy theorized a vast southern land to prevent the world from tipping over, but they had no concrete data. The idea that Carthaginian ships struggling with the coastal currents of West Africa could have then turned south into the ferocious winds and icebergs of the Antarctic circumpolar current, mapped a continent, and returned to tell the tale, stretches credulity past its breaking point. Their ships were not built for such extremes, and their motivation would have been non-existent. Why would merchants risk everything to sail into a howling, frozen void with no prospect of trade? The myth persists because it fulfills a powerful human desire. It corrects what feels like the arrogance of modern history, the idea that our age is the first to know the whole world. It offers a hidden chapter, a secret lineage of knowledge that makes the past feel grander and more mysterious. The attraction is not about Carthage per se, but about the thrill of the puzzle, the possibility that our textbooks are wrong, and that a forgotten people saw the true shape of the earth long before we did. It transforms history from a settled record into a detective story with a missing clue. Ultimately, the Piri Reis map is a beautiful and important historical document, a snapshot of a world in transition, where hard-won Portuguese fact collided with ancient Greek theory and the guesswork of a brilliant Ottoman compiler. To force it to be a photocopy of a Carthaginian satellite image is to miss its true magic. Its value is not as a key to a lost ice age, but as a mirror to the 16th century mind, desperately trying to fit new, bewildering discoveries into the old frames of understanding. The real wonder is not that they might have mapped Antarctica, but that with so little to go on, they tried to map the unknown at all, leaving behind a beautiful, mistaken artifact that continues to spark our imagination and our myths centuries later. The fantasy of hidden maps speaks to a longing for impossible knowledge, a Carthage that knew the world's last secrets, but another kind of impossible beast stalks the edges of their military legend. Beyond the historical elephants, wilder stories insist that Carthaginian generals, in their search for any advantage, unleashed trained lions and leopards upon the battlefield. Imagine the sheer terror of that sight, ranks of armored men breaking before a wave of snarling primal fury. It is a cinematic image of pure shock and awe, but it belongs firmly to the realm of myth. The practical barriers to using big cats as weapons of war are insurmountable, revealing a stark divide between the symbolic power of an animal and its utility as a tool of combat. Training an elephant, while immensely challenging, operates on a different principle. Elephants are highly social, intelligent creatures that form deep bonds with their handlers or mahouts. They can be taught to recognize commands, to charge in a specific direction, and to use their mass as a living battering ram. Their value was in their size, their noise, and their psychological impact on horses unaccustomed to their smell. A lion or leopard, by contrast, is a solitary, instinct-driven predator. Its behavior is ruled by hunger, fear, and aggression, not by loyalty or complex instruction. You cannot train a lion to distinguish friend from foe on a chaotic battlefield, to hold a formation, or to retreat on command. The moment it was released, it would become an indiscriminate agent of chaos, as likely to turn on its own handlers as on the enemy. It would be a liability, not an asset. So where did such a dramatic story come from? The answer lies not in military manuals, but in art and propaganda. The lion was a universal symbol of royalty, strength, and ferocity across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Carthaginian coins, seals, and stelae frequently featured lions, often in scenes associated with the gods or the ruling elite. To a Roman soldier who later saw these artifacts in looted treasure, or to a Greek historian hearing second-hand reports, the symbolic lion could easily be mistaken for a literal one. Furthermore, it is entirely plausible that Carthaginian armies, like many others, kept exotic animals as camp mascots or symbols of regiment pride. A general like Hannibal, aware of his own legendary status, might have kept a caged lion to project an image of untamable power. An enemy scout catching a glimpse of such a beast, or a prisoner hearing its roar at night, could return home with tales of monstrous war lions being prepared for battle. The rumor mill of the ancient world needed little fuel to create a blaze of exaggeration. This myth helps us separate the practical from the fantastical in ancient warfare. Animals were used, but within strict limits of practicality. War dogs, for instance, were common, used for guarding camps, tracking, and harassing light infantry. Horses, of course, were the backbone of cavalry. Even pigs were allegedly used on rare occasions, their squeals said to frighten elephants. Each animal served a specific, manageable purpose. The lion myth represents the point where utility tips over into spectacle, where the desire to intimidate transforms in the telling into something monstrous and unreal. It reflects our own subconscious understanding of Carthage as a place of exotic, almost unnatural danger. If Hannibal could cross the Alps with elephants, what other surprises might he conjure from the African continent? The myth answers that fearful question with a creature from the deepest part of the imagination, a perfect fusion of their foreignness and their feared military ingenuity. In the end, the Carthaginians did not need phantom lions to be terrifying. Their real weapons, the disciplined Iberian infantry, the whirlwind Numidian cavalry, and the strategic mind of Hannibal himself, were frightening enough. The legend of the war lion is a tribute to that fear, a fear so potent it had to be dressed in the skin of a predator to be fully understood. It shows us how an enemy's reputation can grow claws and fangs of its own, long after the last real soldier has left the field. The roar of phantom lions fades into a more ethereal defense, a legend woven not from claws but from mist and faith. Some tales insist Carthage was shielded by a supernatural veil of Tanit, a magical fog or blinding haze summoned by her priests to disorient and panic invading fleets and armies. Imagine a Roman trireme fleet emerging from a clear dawn, only to see the harbor and its formidable walls vanish behind a sudden, impenetrable white curtain, arrows and fire ships lashing out from the silent gloom. It is a powerful image, the city literally cloaked in the favor of its goddess, protected by a divine weather that served its defenders. This myth, however, belongs to the realm of poetic longing, not historical record. Its roots are almost certainly anchored in the very real and dramatic meteorology of the North African coast. The Mediterranean is no stranger to sudden, dense sea mists, especially in certain seasons, rolling in from the sea to swallow headlands and harbors without warning. Combine this with the fierce, dust-laden sirocco winds blowing from the Sahara, which can reduce visibility to nothing in a swirling tan haze, and you have a perfect recipe for seemingly miraculous interventions. A defending Carthaginian admiral, knowing the local patterns, might wisely choose to lure a Roman fleet into a position where the afternoon mist would obscure his movements. To the confused and terrified Roman sailors, this would not feel like tactics, it would feel like sorcery. The myth transforms a commander's understanding of his environment into a priest's direct line to the divine. This reflects a universal human tendency in warfare, especially when facing a seemingly invincible foe. Carthage held out against Rome for decades, surviving brutal sieges and naval blockades. For its citizens and soldiers, how much more comforting to believe their survival was guaranteed by their patron goddess, that the very air and sea would rise to defend them, rather than relying solely on the fragile courage of men and the thickness of stone walls. We see this pattern echoed in the myths of other ancient cities. Troy had its legendary, unbreachable walls built by gods. Babylon was said to be protected by mighty spells inscribed on its gates. The Veil of Tanit is Carthage's version of this archetype, a spiritual fortification to match its physical one. It speaks to the psychological need for an extra layer of security, a belief that one's home is not just strategically sound, but sacred and favored by powers greater than any army. In the terror of a siege, when the ram's thunder echoes against the gate, faith can be as vital a supply as grain or water. The legend ensures that Carthage's resistance is remembered not just as a military feat, but as a cosmic drama, a city so beloved by its goddess that she would shroud it in her own breath. The truth is likely more pragmatic and in its own way more impressive. It suggests a deep, generational knowledge of wind and wave, a home field advantage raised to the level of strategic art. But we must ask ourselves, in the heat of battle, does the distinction even matter? To the Carthaginian archer loosing arrows into the blinding fog, and to the Roman legionary stumbling forward in that same murk, the Veil of Tanit was utterly real. It was the terrifying, tangible fact of not being able to see the enemy, of fighting a landscape that had suddenly turned against you. The myth simply gives a name and a divine purpose to that profound and ancient fear. A goddess could shroud her city in mist, but the treasures that emerged from its workshops seemed touched by a more permanent magic. Among the most coveted exports of Carthage was its glass, a material they did not invent but perfected with a jeweler's precision. From their furnaces came delicate vessels in rich cobalt and amethyst, and tiny, intricate beads that told stories in color. The most famous of these were the millefeury beads, a term meaning 1,000 flowers. Craftsmen would bundle rods of colored glass, heat them, and stretch them into canes so thin that a single cross-section revealed a perfect miniature mosaic of blossoms, stars, or geometric patterns. These beads traveled farther than Carthaginian ships, becoming prized trade items from the deserts of Africa to the forests of northern Europe. Their beauty was so consistent, their colors so vibrant and sealed within the glass that they defied the understanding of later cultures. How could something so delicate be so durable? How could such complex patterns be locked inside a solid, transparent shell? When the answers are lost, imagination provides them. The 24th myth declares that Carthaginian glass was unbreakable and could only be forged or melted in the breath of a dragon. It is a sublime compliment born from a profound technological misunderstanding. The glass was not unbreakable, of course. Drop a Carthaginian perfume vial on a stone floor and it would shatter like any other, but its quality was exceptional. Their mastery of furnace temperatures and chemical additives produced glass that was remarkably clear, resistant to clouding, and less prone to the bubbles and impurities that weakened lesser work. In a world of crude, bubbly glass, theirs seemed preternaturally perfect. The myth of dragon's fire is a direct window into the medieval mind. After the fall of Rome, the knowledge of high-temperature industrial furnaces, capable of reaching the over 1,000 degrees Celsius needed to work glass smoothly, faded from common memory in much of Europe. When a scholar or a king beheld a surviving piece of ancient glasswork, its perfection seemed impossible to replicate with ordinary wood-fired kilns. The explanation required a source of heat beyond human capability, and in the medieval bestiary, the ultimate source of unnatural heat was the dragon. Its breath was not just fire, it was elemental fury, a primal force that could melt stone and forge legendary swords. To say Carthaginian glass required dragon's fire was not to literally believe in dragons, but to acknowledge that the art of its making was lost, its secrets consumed by a flame as mythical as the beast that breathed it. This transformation from skilled artisan to mythical smith is a fate shared by many ancient technologies. The concrete of the Romans, the steel of Damascus, the Greek fire of Byzantium, all were later explained through legends of lost formulas or supernatural aid. When you cannot see the workshop, you invent a wizard. The real magic of Carthaginian glass was in its economic alchemy. These small, beautiful objects were lightweight, non-perishable, and carried immense value. A single strand of millefeury beads could be traded for amber, ivory, or sacks of grain. They were the perfect commodity for a mercantile empire, transforming sand and mineral dyes into portable wealth. The glass did not need to be unbreakable, it only needed to survive the journey and to arrive as a stunning testament to the reach and refinement of the civilization that made it. In the end, the dragon is a metaphor for our own distance from the past. We look at an artifact of stunning craftsmanship, and the gap between its existence and our ability to recreate it feels unbridgeable. So we populate that gap with monsters and miracles. The truth that it was the product of careful observation, repeated experiment, and hands trained over generations is almost more wondrous. It means the flame was human and the magic was patience. The final myth is not about monsters or magic, but about memory itself. It is said that somewhere within the walls of Carthage, perhaps in a temple complex or a royal archive, stood a great library, a repository of knowledge that rivaled the legendary collection in Alexandria. Within its scrolls and codices were unique histories written in the Punic tongue, translations of Egyptian medical texts, star charts from Babylonian astronomers, and the navigational logs of 1,000 voyages. And as the story goes, when the Romans finally broke through, this treasury of human understanding was put to the torch, its wisdom turning to smoke and ash on the wind. It is a haunting what-if of history, the idea that we lost not just a city, but an entire world of thought in a single act of vengeance. But what is the truth behind this poignant legend? Carthage was undoubtedly a city of letters and records. As a mercantile superpower, its very existence depended on meticulous accounting. Contracts for shipments of silver, tin, and grain, treaties with Iberian chieftains and Numidian kings, logs of tides and trade winds, all of this required a sophisticated bureaucracy and extensive archives. Temples would have held religious texts, hymns, and records of omens. The state would have kept chronicles of its laws, its elected suffetes, and its military campaigns. To suggest they had no libraries is absurd. They certainly had collections, but these were likely scattered across different institutions, not consolidated into one monumental public institution like the Mausoleum of Alexandria, which was built with the explicit scholarly mission to collect all the world's knowledge. The Great Library of Alexandria was a philosophical project. The archives of Carthage were a practical necessity. There is a crucial distinction. So, was there a single, vast library of Carthage that was deliberately burned? The ancient sources are silent on such a specific, dramatic act. The historians who detail the sack speak of general looting and destruction, of fires that raged for days, but they do not single out a library as a target. This silence is telling. For Roman writers who loved to boast of their cultural patronage, the deliberate burning of a great library would have been an awkward detail, a stain on their narrative of bringing civilization. Its absence suggests it likely wasn't a notable feature of the city they destroyed, or at least not one they recognized as such. Yet, the destruction of knowledge was undoubtedly total. Think of the mundane, terrifying process of a sack. Soldiers ransacking a scribe's office for valuables would toss aside piles of scrolls, their wax seals and papyrus worthless next to a silver statuette. A fire started to collapse a roof would spread to a temple storeroom, consuming genealogies and land records. The slow, indifferent decay of time would finish what the violence began. Within a generation or two, the language itself began to fade from official use. The unique Carthaginian perspective on history, their own stories of their founding, their kings, their victories and defeats, all of it was filtered first through the chaotic violence of the sack, and then through the deliberate silence of a people forced to adopt the language and identity of their conquerors to survive. This is why the myth of the lost library holds such profound power. It isn't really about a building. It is a symbol for the catastrophic, irreplaceable cultural loss that accompanies the fall of any great civilization. It represents all the songs that were never written down, the recipes that vanished with the last elder who knew them, the technical knowledge of a dye master that died with his guild. Every fallen city, from Nineveh to Tenochtitlan, has its phantom library, the archive of its inner life that turned to dust. For Carthage, this loss feels especially acute because their voice was so thoroughly silenced by their enemies. We have the Aeneid from Rome, but we have no Carthaginian epic of their own voyage from Tyre. We have Roman speeches, but we have no Carthaginian political debates. The library myth gives tangible form to that void. It allows us to mourn not just for fallen stones, but for lost poems, lost star maps, lost conversations. It asks us to consider what our own world would be like if the only record of our culture was written by our fiercest rivals, who had every reason to make us monsters. In the end, the true library of Carthage was not a room of scrolls. It was the living memory of its people, a vast and intricate collection held in minds and spoken in a language that is now silent. And that library, the most precious one of all, was burned not by Roman torches, but by the slow, cold wind of oblivion that blows after every conquest. The myths we have explored are the ghostly afterimages left on that wind, stories we tell to explain the silence, to fill the void where a civilization once stood. Some are slanders, some are fears, and some, like this last one, are our own lament for all that was, and all that we can never know. And so we reach the end of our journey through 25 of the strangest, most persistent myths about ancient Carthage. From the horrifying to the hilarious, the plausible to the utterly fantastical, each story has been a window, but the view is never just of Carthage. It is a double exposure, showing us the ghost of a lost civilization and the reflection of our own minds staring back. What becomes clear is that Carthage's true story, written almost entirely by its bitterest enemies, left behind a profound silence. And into that silence, imagination, fear, and propaganda rushed like a tide, filling the void with monsters, miracles, and lost treasures. These myths, in the end, reveal far more about us, the storytellers, than they do about the people of Carthage. They expose our need for simple villains and heroic narratives, our longing for hidden knowledge and poetic justice, and our timeless habit of painting the unfamiliar as monstrous to justify its destruction. The real Carthage is forever just out of reach, a silhouette seen through the smoke of its own burning, but perhaps that is the final, enduring lesson. History is not a collection of settled facts, but an ongoing conversation between the evidence we find and the stories we choose to believe. So, what do you think? What's the strangest Carthaginian myth you've ever encountered, or is there another wild tale we missed? The conversation continues down in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's shadows, smash that like button, it truly helps, and subscribe for more journeys into the greatest mysteries of our past. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told. The truth is often hiding in the quiet space between the lines.